Good morning, true believers. Welcome to another episode of Sunday Morning Superheroes, where we talk about everything from John the Disciple to the latest issue of Spider Man. And today we are going to be taking another dive into the Spider Verse, talking about one of the most iconic characters in the Spider Man mythos, Venom, and specifically what Venom can illustrate about DID, anti-heroism, and Christianity. And as a special guest on this episode, we have a super awesome guest star who's going to come and dialogue with me on this topic. And I am going to bring out right now. Hello.
Hello. Hi, it's good to be here.
It's so good to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, give everyone an idea, who is Constellation?
Hi, I am an author and a artist and a DID system. I have written a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, published short stories and poetry, and at this point do a lot of advocating online for the unusual mental health condition I have, which is dissociative identity disorder. So I have various social media outlets that I use to share about DID and just kind of advocate for, like, this is what life is like with it. This is how, you know, how DID is experienced. This is how it develops. And I do a lot of faith-based and just scriptural and emotional content as well, just talking about like what it's like as a person who is a Christian walking through the journey of living with DID. So that's kind of the thrust of my online platform at this point.
That sounds really awesome, actually. That is
Thank you.
not something that I see a lot of Christians speaking about specifically,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, that
it
was
is a real issue.
specifically why I
Oh,
do
sorry.
it. No
Yeah.
problem. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's awesome. But like as just a guy walking through life, I have at least three different people I can say at this point that I know who are a DID system. So
Hmm.
it seems to be, maybe it's just that the odds are just all lining up and I'm running into a bunch of them. But it does becoming, for me anyway, more and more of
Right.
a topic I have to be aware of.
Hmm. It's actually as common as natural redheads.
Yes, I've heard that statistic.
Yes. So they're all
Wit,
DID systems are all around us. It's just, yeah, like you said, in the church, not often a topic that people talk about. Mental health on the whole could use more advocacy and um, more being talked about more in the church. But especially DID, I find is underrepresented, and it's good to share about and it's good to speak out about because there are a lot of people out there who are either living with it or supporting those who are living with it, and it's really not what a lot of films and TV shows make it out to look like. And so I like to advocate for real people with DID for that reason.
that's awesome. That's awesome. Speaking of that, that gets us right into one of the discussion topics for today, which is for somebody who's listening in on a wacky superhero Christian podcast, has never heard of DID before. Can you give us a basic breakdown explanation of what exactly DID is and what you mean when you say a DID system?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. Um, DID stands for dissociative identity disorder. This used to be called multiple personality disorder, but I believe it was in the 80s that that name got changed, partly because the MPD label was so sensationalized in media that it was not even resembling what DID actually is. So dissociative identity disorder is a trauma disorder. It's not a personality disorder. It is a trauma disorder and a dissociative disorder, and it is developed in early childhood as a response to overwhelming trauma. And essentially, what happens in DID is when a young child whose personality has not yet formed and developed is going through overwhelming and incredibly stressful traumatic life circumstances, and they are unable to integrate those events and things into their sense of reality and their sense of self because they have no ability to process it, because they are young, because they don't have support people to help them process it. They can develop what's known as DID, which is where instead of developing a singular sense of who you are, your identity, your personality, instead you develop multiple senses of who you are that you switch between to handle the different traumatic circumstances that are surrounding you as a child. And so someone essentially will be switching from one personality to another in their everyday life. And it can look very, very subtle. A lot of people have DID. You would never know that they have it. It's not at all like you see in TV shows sometimes or movies where it's very sensationalized. Like it can be very, very covert. And that's part of the purpose of it, is to handle those overwhelming circumstances in the most covert, safe way as you possibly can. Does that feel like a good enough explanation? Do you need any
Oh
more
yeah.
context? And yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I can definitely
Mhm.
say from my experience with people who are DID system, it is often not what Hollywood would make it out to be. Like, for instance, I've
Yeah.
worked with an actor who has a DID system. And unless that actor verbally told me that they were switching, I would not be able to know that they were a different personality at any time. It's not
Mhm.
like the crazy like Dr. Jekyll,
Mm-mm.
Mr. Hyde type thing that
No, not at
is,
all.
like transformation thing. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
And I will
Mhm.
say I have heard someone give a theory floating around in some circles of psychology right now that every child starts as a DID system, like an early
Mhm.
development, that's actually everybody. And part of the maturation process is melding those personalities together into a single personality. And that for a DID system, like you said, as a result of trauma, they just don't meld in the way that is typical.
Right. Yeah, that is the prevailing professional theory, I believe, or prevailing prevailing theory in the therapeutic field, I believe, is the theory of structural dissociation, they call it, which is the idea that when you are born, you don't have a sense of self. You sort of have self states, and you do switch between them to handle different things, which is why you see small toddlers or babies that may be happy one minute and sobbing, angry the next, and then go back to being happy. It's because they don't have an integrated sense of all those things yet, and that's something that happens with safety and with growth and learning as they get older. And when you have DID, when you have severe trauma that's happening at young ages, it can interrupt that integrative process. So when you don't end up putting those pieces together into a cohesive whole, then you develop with these kind of different tracks, so to speak. And maybe I should have said this before, but people with DID, their different personalities aren't different modes. They can be very different people from each other. They can have completely different personalities. They may have, and usually do have, amnesia between them, which can make it so that one alter or part might remember something another does not, which is part of the way they protect themselves and function in everyday life. It can be a very effective way to function, because then you can put the trauma somewhere else while you deal with school or work. But then it can also raise challenges later in life when you do start to process and deal with those things, is that you have compartmentalized that trauma. And so the healing process involves bringing that into the light and helping the parts or alters that held that trauma and went through that to be able to live a freer life. Some people choose to integrate or fuse those parts, some people choose not to. But all the parts are just as much a valid part of that human being. A lot of times people misconceptualize it as like there's one real person and then the alters are kind of fake personas or coping mechanisms, but in reality, every part of that person is a part of that human being and just as valid.
And though I know I can't, as a English person, I can't speak for everybody out there in the different psychology fields or any of that, but I can say that every expert in psychology that I've ever had a conversation with, whether other professors on my campus who teach psychology or friends of the family I have who work as practicing psychiatrists, I've never met anybody who have presented that idea that there's just one real real
Hmm.
alter and it being fake. All of them have affirmed the value of the different alters, and
Hmm.
none of them have ever said that only one of them is real. So,
Yeah, thankfully that's
uh,
more and more common now, as there's been more awareness brought to DID and more people have talked about their experiences with it.
good, good, good.
Yeah.
So, listeners, you may be wondering what on earth any of this has to do with the comic book character Venom. Well, the thing is, Venom, though I'm not going to say that it is exactly or even anywhere close to exactly one for one DID, there is a similarity in how Venom functions as a character with a DID system, in that you've got two different personalities that are cohabitating a body with the Venom character, because you have the human Eddie Brock, but you also have the alien symbiote that has bonded with him and that gives him all of the various powers that he has. And
Hmm.
so you have two different personalities with very different backgrounds that are now functioning as a unit. And actually, one of the really interesting things about the Venom character is the use of the plural pronoun, where they always use we. We are Venom, and us, and our, and all of those sorts of things. And so,
Hmm.
in that way, there's a similarity to a DID system, somewhat like, I've never read Stephanie Meyer's The Host, but people have also drawn parallels in that book to someone with DID, of a human and an alien creature inhabiting the same body. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on to talk about this Venom character. I'm going to give a quick background for anybody who's not super familiar with Venom, just real quick history of this character, and then we will start chatting as the points go on and what connections we can bring. Very famously, the story of Venom kind of begins before Venom proper with Spider Man's black costume, which is something that came about in the early 80s. It was a costume, it looks exactly like this from the famous Web of Spider Man issue 1, where Spider-Man was a part of a massive crossover in Marvel Comics called Marvel Superhero Secret Wars, which they're about to make a movie of, interestingly. Anywho, uh, Spider-Man was on an alien planet and his costume got destroyed in this huge battle. And so he went to what he believed was a clothing machine that created this new costume for him that was black and white as opposed to his traditional red and blue. And this costume had some interesting abilities that his normal one didn't. It could transform itself into any type of clothing he could imagine. He could just think about a type of clothing and the costume would morph and shift to that. The costume also created its own webbing. So Spider Man traditionally has had to have web shooters that he uses to shoot his web out. But this costume created a unlimited supply of webbing for him. And also the costume amplified his powers in different ways. So with this black suit, he was substantially stronger than he had been on his own. But he believed that this was just a advanced piece of alien technology that had created this costume. But he later discovered that this was not, in fact, a piece of technology. This was a living organism that was called an alien symbiote that had attached itself to Peter. And he was, as most people would be under the circumstances, pretty disgusted and frightened when he found out that that was the case. And so he wanted to remove it. But the problem was, it really liked Peter and didn't want to be removed. And so it was a battle to get rid of it. And that battle culminated in this issue where Peter is fighting this symbiote that is at this point trying to take control of him. And they wind up, interestingly, in a cathedral. And
Mm.
one of the weaknesses of the symbiote is loud noises. It's very vulnerable to extreme sounds, heard it. And so Peter was banging against the bells, trying to injure it and get it weak enough to where it would get off of him. But the bells started tolling on the hour, and being that close to bells, as pretty much everyone knows, even for a human, is very dangerous. And Peter winds up getting himself knocked out and in danger of serious damage from the bells being that close in proximity to him. And that's when one of the ironies of the comic, the symbiote had learned compassion from Peter, and it had learned empathy from being with Peter for so long and seeing him be a hero. And so the symbiote decides to sacrifice itself to remove Peter from the sound of the bells, and then assumedly disintegrates and dies from the noise from the bells. And that
Mm.
was what was supposed to be in the comic books the end of the saga of the Black Suit. But it wasn't to be, because when a new creative team took over the Spider-Man stories and they came up with a new villain initially, which was going to be Venom. He first appeared technically fully in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 300, pictured here. And this is what he looked like initially in the comic. As you can see, a much more muscular version of that black suited Spider-Man, but also with a very creepy mouth that initially did not have sharp teeth, but later on other artists added sharp teeth to the mouth, etc. And what they revealed the backstory of this new villain to be was that it was a human reporter named Eddie Brock who believed his life was ruined by Spider-Man because he had been doing a story. He was a journalist. He'd done a story about a serial killer called the Sin Eater, and he had come in contact with an individual who was claiming to be the Sin Eater and giving him an exclusive behind the scenes story of why he was doing what he did, what drove him to this. But then Spider-Man caught the Sin Eater, and when Spider-Man captured him, it was revealed that he was not the person that Eddie Brock had been talking to. That person was a fake who was just trying to get attention in the media. And this destroyed Eddie Brock's credibility as a reporter, that he had revealed a serial killer to not be the person he actually was. And this destroyed Brock's career. He was fired from the newspaper he worked at. He couldn't get a job as a reporter anywhere respectable. He had to start writing like I was abducted by alien stories for like rag magazines. And he got really, really depressed. His wife left him, and he got so depressed he actually was contemplating suicide. But Eddie Brock was raised Catholic, and he knew that suicide was a sin. And so he went to a church to pray for God's forgiveness for having suicidal ideation. And it just so happened that that was the same church where the black suit had come off of Peter. And it discovered Eddie, and as pictured here, bonded itself to Eddie and then became Venom. Initially, Venom was a villain in the Spider-Man comics. Both the symbiote and Eddie believed that Spider-Man had ruined their lives, and so together their goal was basically to get revenge on Spider-Man by killing him, straight up, just straight up dead. That's what they wanted. But as the stories went on, they started to show more and more complexity to the Venom character, in that he hates Spider-Man in particular, but he wasn't a traditional villain in that he also really cared about innocent people. And he actually, in the first few issues, there were times where he kills an innocent person for various reasons, like, for instance, when he's breaking out of jail one time. But he always showed this remorse over that. And later on, he very much comes to a point where he decides he's not going to be letting any innocent people become collateral damage in these battles he's having with Spider-Man anymore. And so that was different than most Spider-Man villains at the time, where he's obviously a bad guy for Spider-Man, but he's also got a sense of ethics and lines that he's not willing to cross. And besides just, wanting to kill Spider-Man, there wasn't much other evil things that he was doing per se. And indeed, in later stories, him and Spider-Man actually resolved their differences and Venom becomes more or less an anti-hero character in the vein of the Punisher, where he tries to protect innocent people from bad guys, and he's very okay with killing those bad guys in the process of that. So, what I want to bring in here is, first of all, the differences and the similarities between this kind of character and someone with DID. I think one of the things off the top of my head that I can see as a non expert is that there are only two of them in this. There's the symbiote and there's Eddie. But most real DID systems involve more than two alters. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe the clinical criteria is to have at least two,
Okay.
um, but I have never heard of a DID system that had only two alters. I think probably because young children who have not yet integrated all parts of themselves have more than two parts of themselves, and so it's pretty unusual or rare for someone to only have two alters. Um, so that's either rare or non-existent in my experience.
Gotcha. Cool, cool. I do think one of the areas, though, that does seem to mesh is how Eddie and the symbiote have to work together. And one of the interesting things is in the early comics, you never really get to be inside of their head because they're not the main character. They're the
Hmm.
antagonist, in that. But like I said, Venom always refers to themselves as a we, as a plurality. The famous catchphrase is they say, "We are Venom," right? As opposed to one person being Venom. And they have
Hmm.
this idea that the two of them together are this entity, that they're not like just one or the other, they are now meshed together in different ways.
Hmm.
And there are times where obviously there's a dialogue going on, but the reader is only privy to one side of it because Eddie will be talking to the symbiote, and you can tell that the symbiote is responding inside of his mind, but we're not privy to that, so we're not seeing the other side of the conversation. We're only seeing Eddie's part of it. Now, is that more of a sensationalist type of thing in terms of, or just fictionalized in terms of, again, a human with an alien living in the same body,
Right.
or is that something real where alters do actually talk to each other?
I would say it depends on the DID system. Um, the system, and for those who aren't familiar with the terminology, you would refer to the system being all the different parts of the person with DID. And so if I refer to my system, I mean myself as an alter and all of the other alters that are in the system of this brain. Um, so with the DID system, some are more verbal, I would say, where they do have dialogues back and forth. My system tends to communicate more in feelings and
Hmm.
concepts. We don't tend to use verbal words as often, but we do sometimes, especially if we're writing down our dialogue as we go. Writing down things on paper or typing them can be a good way for us to communicate back and forth and have different parts come forward to say what they need to say. Um, but yes, dialogues do often happen in DID systems and often need to happen in order to function effectively as a team. I would say another big difference with that is that, a lot of people almost think of DID systems as having almost like, the person and alien entities, like it's not something outside of you. It is actually a part of yourself as a whole human being. Um, So, but in the same way, we do have to have dialogues and conversations because it can still feel very alien. It can feel very foreign. It can feel like somebody else entirely. Even though it is a part of the same brain and body that you have, it can be a very interesting experience to have to dialogue with another whole part of yourself that has very different thoughts and feelings than you do.
And that is definitely a big part of the Venom character
Mm.
because you have these two entities that are very different in that one of them is a human on Earth who's lived on Earth his whole life, and then you have
Mhm.
this other alien creature that has been to some different places in the universe. Um, Another way I want to take this is the more original, if we're going to call it that, position I'd like to, or way of viewing Venom that I want to talk about is Venom was created in the 1980s by some comic book creators who are some more than others vocally or just in their art rebellious against traditional American culture and traditional conservative American culture. And as I was thinking about Venom and rereading, especially the earliest Venom comics, I started to think that perhaps Venom might actually, in some ways, whether consciously on the part of the comic book creators or not, reflect how they saw the American church at the time, and perhaps even in some ways to this day. And the similarities I see, I'm going to break down, and Constellation, you feel free to interrupt and interject at any point here in terms of the discussion. But I do want to start with Eddie, in that he's fascinating in that he has a very explicitly Christian background, and that he was raised Catholic, and that in the 80s anyway, was kind of pop culture default Christian denomination tended to be
Mm-hmm.
Catholic. And
Mm-hmm.
so that I think is shorthand for representing Christianity as a whole in many ways in pop culture. So he has that background. And you can tell that he has a lot of those ethics, right? Because the whole reason he was in that church to begin with is because he knew suicide was a sin. And so he was wanting to repent and seek God's forgiveness for that. And that whole so that ethics kind of remains with him, especially with the whole thing he has about innocent people and his
Mm-hmm.
desire to preserve the lives of innocent people and only fighting people he considers to be evil. Um, Now, of course, he probably is not the best judge of character, as again his issues with Spider-Man shows, but
Yes.
he has that whole system, and I think that this reflects how I think a lot of that generation of creators probably would have seen the American church kind of from an outside perspective, or like they'd been raised in church, but then they walked away as adults type perspective. In that, um, well, I'll do one more thing first. Eddie, the fact that he was a journalist as a background, I think, is meaningful to this because journalists primarily tell stories for a living. They are a type of storyteller. And Eddie is living inside of a story constantly in these comics, where it is a story where he is the main character and he is the victim of what has happened. It is Spider-Man ruined his life. He was this awesome, great reporter, and then everything would have been awesome unless till Spider-Man came around and exposed this killer and ruined his journalist career and then ruined his life. And he now has been given this special power, and he's got an opportunity to now rewrite his story to make himself avenged of Spider-Man and forward. And everybody lives in stories, whether they're cognizant of it or not. But I do think that the American church has been very particularly living inside of a story wherein they are the main character. And it's also been a story where they are oftentimes the victim, where they paint themselves as the victim of the story, that society is against them, the government is against them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of everything bad that happens to them, it's not their fault. It's because of these other bad actors out there, whether it's the government or the media or whatever. And I just see that striking parallel with Eddie because the truth is, and again, this is me saying this as a Christian, as a active member of an American church. The church, I think, in America has had a real problem with not recognizing when bad things have happened because of our actions, not because of
Mm-hmm.
us being a victim of someone. And that's, I imagine, what was more undercover in the 80s has obviously become more explicit now, where we've had many pastors exposed for abuse of various kinds of power, whether it's abuse of individuals or abuse of funding or abuse of plagiarism, claiming
Mm-hmm.
ideas to be theirs that weren't really. And it just seems like this character, again, whether they thought about it consciously or not, has those parallels of perhaps what they saw in the American church. And I think as a Christian, whenever we encounter these things in the media, our gut reaction should not be, oh, wow, here are secular people persecuting us again. But rather, I think the first thing we need to do is in humility is be more curious about, okay, why do they think that? Why is
Mhm.
it that they perceive us as being that way? And is there any truth to it? And
Mhm.
if there is, our response needs to be rethinking and repentance rather than up in arms.
Mhm. I think we should be characterized by humility and repentance in the church.
Hmm.
And we're told to always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that is within us. And I think
Mm,
far too often people are more prepared to give a defense for their actions or their behavior
mm.
than to have been a beacon of hope and to have reasons for that.
Indeed, indeed. And the other side of it, I think, is the DID and the symbiote as well. I think that a lot of people have perceived the American church as almost being like a DID system, and that at times they see the very real compassion and empathy that still exists in the American church and existed in the 80s. The American church, for all its critics, has done some very amazing things in American history. The evangelical church was very involved in abolition in the 1800s leading up to and continuing through the Civil War. The American church has been involved in the fight for education of children. That has been a traditional thing that the church in America, all across the board, denominationally, there we go, has been interested in. The majority of nonprofits in America have been influenced, if not founded, by Christians or churches. There's still all this good that the American church has done and continues to do. Evangelicals tend to be one of the highest donors to both domestic charities and foreign aid to countries around the world. Just
Hmm.
like Eddie is not just a black and white bad person, he does actually care about people he considers to be innocents. And he really, in the comics, does do some real good by protecting people in the comics. And that's something I think that in the church we can celebrate internally, and externally people can still look at and realize, okay, this is something that has actually been good and positive. But then I know that a lot of people have the experience of seeing that and then having this kind of mental whiplash or cognitive dissonance when they see that, and sometimes the same exact people being very generous, being very charitable to a certain group of people, and then turn around and are very uncharitable to another. And that's where I think we also see the violent nature of Venom come in. There have been Christians in the history of America who have been, just, I'm going to say it frankly, in their rhetoric, very bombastic and
Hmm.
hateful, frankly, towards certain groups of people in the history of America. There have definitely been churches in history that have been racist. There have been groups of Christians who have been just frankly violent in the sense
Hmm.
of, yeah, the solution is just to kill them all, right? That entire group of people, just wipe them out. If you did that, things would be so much better. And, the history of America is also checkered with those different things. Like, for instance, the Native Americans in the history of America, how they were treated by and large, and the ways
Hmm.
in which some groups of Christians, not all of them by any means, but some groups of Christians tried to tell a story, right, where they recasted the Native Americans as like the Canaanites and themselves as the Israelites coming in who had this divine right to just wipe them out and make room for themselves. It's, again, to be fair, these things are very jarring for someone outside the church to see those
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
And I could see how someone could see the church almost in a DID situation where they're like, well, sometimes you act like this, but then other times you act like this. So
Hmm.
what's the real part?
Hmm. And I would say too that for someone with DID, especially someone with DID who's grown up in a spiritual background, oftentimes part of what causes the disorder itself is that cognitive dissonance of seeing, especially maybe people in the church saying and doing one thing and then saying and doing very different things, or having completely different experiences even with the same person. For a child who is trying to form their concept of reality and like, who am I, who are the people I'm with, what is safe, what is unsafe, what is what does life look like, what do I believe, to experience that cognitive dissonance over and over again can be a very huge part of what causes them to develop DID in the first place. And I have known and spoken with a lot of DID systems who grew up with religious backgrounds. And I think that tends to be a very common story, is a lot of them walked away from their faith because part of the way that they developed their DID was because people of faith had hurt them. And that can be very sad to hear those stories and to know that that happens and that exists. And a lot of people have had those kinds of identity breaking and dissonance creating experiences with people who are outwardly saying they profess Christ, but maybe doing things that are very discordant with who he is.
Yes, definitely. And I can definitely, even as somebody inside the church, as you and I both are, I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure I'm sure that we can both say we've met people, right, who give us that kind of cognitive dissonance as well, where I've seen people who have been, like, again, legitimately charitable and generous and compassionate to certain people, and then will turn around to another group of people and be brutally callous in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that does cause cognitive dissonance for, I think, anybody to say, wow, how, how could how can this be? How could you be so loving to orphans, right? Or just as an example, to orphans, and yet be so callous to people who disagree with you in politics, right? Like, it's
Right.
just,
Mm-hmm.
such a bizarre thing. Like, you would never, treat one group of people this way, but oh, the Democrats, right? You'll totally vilify them and paint them as just terrible, evil people all the time. And I say that not to be political. I've known Christians who will do that to Republicans too. So,
Right.
over no matter what political way you
Right.
go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah,
And I think that, anyone can be dissonant to themselves and have that sort of hypocrisy. But I can see how you would say with the DID system that might be more pronounced, because you may have different alters who have vastly different opinions or feelings or ways of approaching reality, and interacting with someone when you don't know that can be very, at times it can be confusing, because you're like, well, this person says, I love chocolate milk. And the next day they're like, I don't like chocolate milk. Why would you offer it to me? Like, there can be that sort of confusion to, well, you're saying this thing, but you're saying this other thing. And so we tend to carry our cognitive dissonance into life in a very unusual way, compared to someone who does not have DID, but may still have dissonant parts to themselves, things they're not looking at about themselves. And in some ways, it's more flagrantly on the surface with someone who has DID than someone who is maybe just concealing it from not just all other people, but also from themselves.
that makes a lot of sense. The self-deception can be one of
Mm-hmm.
the most difficult types.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, again, one of the things with Venom as well. Like, the fact that he has to make it Spider-Man's fault for
Mm-hmm.
his life being ruined, when in reality it's his own fault. He was the one who wrote the articles. He was the one who decided to print these stories, and he was the one who decided to sensationalize this person who was claiming to be the serial killer. And
Mm-hmm.
it was really all his fault. Spider-Man was doing the right thing by being a superhero and fighting a bad guy and turning him in.
Mm-hmm.
But he can't let himself be the bad guy. And that's something I think that the American church does have a real hard time with. We, I think, often tell ourselves a story wherein we are the main character, and if anything bad happens, it's someone else's fault. But the
Mm-hmm.
problem with that is that we should be telling a story where Jesus is the main character.
Exactly.
You know, it's so dangerous when we put the spotlight on ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in some ways, what you're describing of Venom, although I can see the parallels to DID, and I'm definitely not a mental health professional, so
Mm.
anything I say take with a grain of salt. But in some ways, he sounds almost more like someone with like a narcissistic personality disorder, where there's this narrative of, well, I can't look at my own shame. I can't look at the things that have happened to me that have caused me so much pain. What I can do is look at somebody else and say they're the cause of my pain, which is often a struggle for people with NPD, is that shame can be very, very difficult to look at and to process because of what they've been through. And so they can tend to have that sort of um, approach to reality that you're describing for Venom, where it can be very difficult to then turn back and look and say, what was my part in this? Um, so in some ways, it reminds me of almost more of that diagnosis. At least Eddie himself as a character, it almost reminds me a little bit more of the struggles that someone with NPD may struggle with.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other side of it, where maybe the other alter like thing going, is that
Mm-hmm.
the symbiote is in many ways almost completely empathetic, in that partially because it learned that from Spider-Man, from being bonded to Spider-Man for a long period of time, because Peter is such a sympathetic, empathetic person.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of clash, right? Where it's almost like the symbiote just totally feeds off of the emotions of its host, right? So that's part of why it becomes like almost subservient to Brock, and is willing to do things with Brock that it wouldn't have done otherwise, because it
Mm-hmm.
just absorbs the feelings that Brock had. Like, for instance, the symbiote didn't really hate Peter at the end. It even risked its life to save him at the very end of it. But once it got bonded with Brock, it kind of just felt the same emotions that Brock felt. And so it just absorbed the hatred that Eddie
Mm-hmm.
had. And
Mm-hmm.
so that could also be an interesting dynamic of that can happen, I think, with real separate people, where you have a narcissist
Yes.
and somebody who's an empath who kind of just is more of a follower who just goes behind
Mm-hmm.
whatever that narcissist does.
Yeah, well, someone who they don't have their own sense of identity, they don't have a strong sense of who they are, and so they attach to someone else and look to that person to provide them that sense of reality and that sense of stability. And have that sort of like, they're just, yeah, like you said, a very follower mentality, where then they can't look outside that person's perspective because they always have to be aligned with. Um, Although it sounds like with Venom, are there sometimes, having not watched or seen any, read any Venom, is there sometimes conflict between those
Yes,
two?
there is.
Which
Yes.
that can be a little bit more like what you might see in a DID system that has not done healing work to work together. Is there can be initially in the beginning stages for some systems a lot of conflict between different alters who have very different outlooks or goals in life, and they have to figure out, how do I work together to accomplish something that is a compromise that all parts of me can accept and live with.
Definitely. What's interesting though is that with Venom, it's actually the converse, because in the beginning of the Venom stories, they're on the same page about they only have really one goal, which is kill Spider-Man. And so they're on that. But then as the stories progress and they start to move beyond that to looking at the wider world and seeing what are other things that they could spend their life doing, they have some common ideas like protecting innocent people, etc. But there are times when they conflict, right? Because there are times when Brock thinks they should go one way, Eddie Brock thinks will go one way, and the symbiote thinks, no, that's really stupid. Why would you do that? And vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And I, there are times when the symbiote can actually take control just on the basis of its nature as a symbiote and basically the source of all their powers, where it
Mm-hmm.
can basically just decide, nope, I'm in the driver's seat now, and more
Mm-hmm.
or less take control of the body. And that happens occasionally in the comics when there's a real conflict of interest and the symbiote just puts its foot down.
And that can happen in a DID system as well. One alter has, as we would say in my system, yeet power, and and ends up pushing the other alter out of the front to accomplish whatever it is that they're needing or wanting to do at that time. And like I said, in some systems, when there's dysfunction within the system and you haven't worked on healing those differences so you can work together, that can be a problem for some DID systems, is just to have that feeling of like you almost feel betrayed because another part of you did something you would never do. um, Thankfully, I don't, as a system, deal with that a lot. But it happens sometimes when you are on different pages or have a very different perspective on a situation.
And I assume then that the more healthy outcome in a situation like that would be to attempt to come to some kind of resolution
Mm-hmm.
where everyone can agree on a course of action rather than just one alter deciding, nope, this is how it's going to be.
Right. Yeah. You have to be able to compromise and work together, and be willing to listen to the other alters, to be willing to listen to their perspectives, because often they have some insight on the situation that you might not, because they've lived very different life experiences. And one of the biggest aspects of working together is being able and willing to take the time to delve into what every alter's experiences are and what they think and feel about a situation, because otherwise you could be steamrolling over a very valid perspective that is going to bring wisdom to whatever you're dealing with at the moment. um, and to not do that, to not take the time to work with the other alters, um, you can end up getting yourself in a situation where there are a lot of, there's a lot of distress or anger or frustration that ends up getting stuffed down. And then you have to deal with it all later. And I feel like in the same way, kind of circling back to the topic of the church, we have to be willing to listen to perspectives. We have to be willing to stop and say, well, this person has very different life experiences than I do. We may all be part of the same church. We may all be engaging with the same situation, but what wisdom are they bringing to this experience or this issue or whatever it might be that maybe I don't have background to understand, and maybe they can give me a perspective that I didn't have, and together we are actually stronger in order to face the complexities of these issues.
Definitely, definitely. And that, to circle back around to something you pointed out earlier, it's very interesting that you talk about Eddie being a narcissist, because one thing that I think outsiders have said about the church, which frankly, just thinking critically, is probably true, is that the church does in America tend to elevate narcissists to positions of power and influence inside of the
Hmm.
church, sadly. Now, I'm by no
Hmm.
means claiming that every pastor or everyone who wants to be a pastor is a narcissist. Of course not.
No.
But there have been pastors, more than I can count on two hands, actually, in the history of the American church, who have been textbook narcissists
Hmm.
in how they operate. And that's something that I think people outside the church pick up on. Like, again, perhaps if Venom really is, whether consciously or subconsciously on the part of these comic book creators, a reflection of what they saw in the American church, that's something I think that is probably true, and we need to be humble enough to admit and address.
Hmm. Hmm. I think it's very easy for narcissists to rise to a position of power and influence because they can be very charming and they can be very charismatic, and they often are very skilled, and so, but if you don't have um, that self-reflective skill to look at your own experiences and look at your own mistakes and those kinds of things, if you've never done the work to evaluate your own life and your own actions in the way that is important, and if you haven't been set up to get to have any examples of that, maybe in your childhood or your life, you may present outwardly very shiny, so to speak, to other people. And the church often is full of people who are maybe a little bit more like the symbiote, very trusting, very open and accepting, very willing to listen and have compassion, because they are looking for someone to, you know, lead them and guide them and give them, advice and counsel. And so it can be very easy to get sucked into the perspective of someone who's very confident, and who has what seems like a very solid basis of, this is how you live life, or this is how you see an issue. When we really need to be able to look first to scriptures and first to, God's word, and saying, where are we getting our ideas from? And when someone's speaking, do they line up with the words of Christ? Like the Bereans who searched the scriptures before even listening to what an apostle was telling them. Because it can be very easy for fallible human beings to either attach to someone who is leading them in the wrong direction and see that as, oh, God must be leading me through this person, or to be that person who is, because they have support from others, sees themselves as sort of infallible.
Very much so, very much so. But like you said, the real antidote to that, in addition to, I would say, mental health counseling for someone who is a actual diagnosable narcissist, is, like you said, the plurality of perspectives, right? Getting more perspectives, working with others rather than just thinking that you understand everything initially. And that is a thing we see play out with Eddie and the symbiotes. Actually, the Venom movie, the first one, is quite good, actually, at doing that perspective of the symbiote and Eddie and their conflicts, and how each one actually brings something. Because on the one hand, the symbiote is this alien creature, right, who has all these experiences in the universe, the larger universe, and that kind of knowledge and experience. But Eddie is a human, so he understands how things work on Earth, right? To be able to navigate Earth, and they have to learn how to work together to do those things. And the Venom movie, I'm pretty fond of it. It's not the best superhero movie ever made, but they did a good job of showing that and bringing out some of the humor in that process as well. That was fun.
And I can relate to some of that as a DID system, when there can be some alters who are much more grounded in life experiences of this is things I went through. This is how people have been. This is how, I've went through a hard time. And they had a lot more sort of boots on the ground experience dealing with, people at church or friendships or tough times. And then there are some alters who maybe have been more protected from those things, because that's kind of how it tends to happen, is sometimes some parts are more shielded from the harsh realities, and some parts protect by putting themselves in those situations to stop the other parts from being in there. And those parts may have a very beautiful, glorious, sort of ethereal approach to life that they are bringing that is just as true and just as real, but you need both sides of that equation to have a more full picture of reality. Yes, these true, beautiful, glorious things, there's, attachments and safety and faith and relationships with others and with God, and joy and light and all of these things. Another alter may not have experience with that, but they may have experience with looking evil in the face, dealing with conflict, standing up for yourself. And you need both sides of that to function as a person in life, and to be able to look at the whole reality of the situation. I really liked what you said about the antidote to essentially the issue of narcissism, the antidote being able to look at different perspectives, because I think that is ultimately every human being needs to be able to do that. And that can be sort of what is the struggle with narcissism, or sometimes within the church, is this idea of there's only one perspective, there's only one right way to see it. And yes, the scriptures are one way. We have one way to God, one way through Jesus Christ to be saved. But we can sometimes apply that concept very broadly across, there's only one way to believe about this thing, or one way to see this kind of situation, when it, at least to understand other perspectives or to hear them, is still going to give wisdom and still going to give insight.
I think that's so important. And like you said, even though there are some things that in Christianity, we, the church, have to hold on to really tightly, as in one Savior, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all. Yes. I think that it actually cheapens the primacy of those things when we make everything only a one-way thing, right? Like
Hmm.
when we start to make every single issue a one way only issue, I think that that ultimately cheapens the importance of the things that really are only one, only one,
Hmm.
only one Lord, only one Savior, only one salvation, as you talked about. But when we start to make, well, only one way to look at the Book of Lamentations, like that,
Right, right.
that's where it starts to become okay.
Hmm.
We're starting to go too far here,
Yeah, this
and
one it starts
that's
to look like the Pharisees, where you were
mhm,
tithing the mint and cumin, so to speak. You are
exactly,
requiring exacting standards to every person that may be backbreaking for another person to have to follow with.
exactly. In that same way, again, to kind of try to put a bow on this whole thing at the end, that idea of listening to others and being able to see other people and sometimes maybe realize that someone that you thought was your enemy is actually on your same side. That is one of the things that, just personally speaking, I get very weary sometimes of the way we Christians fight each other. And
Hmm.
we treat our own like they are enemies. And that is, I think, another thing we ultimately see in the Venom story, of Venom being so obsessed with seeing Spider-Man as this evil person, that he's got to vilify him because he's making him the scapegoat. But there's a
Hmm.
really beautiful story, actually, where Venom kind of has his final turning point, where he and Spider-Man are fighting a big knockdown, draw out battle. And in the middle of it, Eddie Brock's ex-wife was actually there, and debris starts collapsing. There's like a big electrical tower that starts to fall on top of her, and Venom goes in to save her, and he's trying to lift up this thing to keep it from crushing her, and it's too much for him. It's too heavy, and he realizes that he can't keep it up, and it's going to fall and crush this person that he loves and cares about. And then suddenly Spider-Man comes behind him, and he grabs the pole too, and he says, "It's going to be okay, Eddie. We can do this together." And together they are able to lift it and to save his ex. And that's the moment where he finally realized that Spider-Man wasn't the person that he'd always painted him to be, of this evil person, but he does actually help save innocent people. And that's the moment where they kind of go from being enemies to frenemies
Hmm.
as the series progresses. And that, I think, is, if anyone can take one major lesson from that Venom story inside the church, I think that's a big one, is realizing who your actual enemies are and who is really not in the grand scheme
Hmm.
of things.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's a beautiful thought.
Cool, cool. Well, I want to thank you again so much, Constellation, for being on the show. You are only the second person I've ever had on the show as a guest, and I really, really appreciate you coming on. For anybody who wants to take a closer look at Constellation's advocacy, you are very active on Instagram, right?
Hmm. Instagram
Cool,
and
cool.
TikTok are the main platforms where I talk about DID. And I
Okay,
also have an Instagram account for my my writing, my poetry, my sci-fi and fantasy that I write.
that's awesome. And I have two different of the hashtags, or the ats.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, I'm not hip with the lingo. So there's
Yes.
at
So my
Constellation Rising. Oh, sorry, go
yes,
ahead.
Constellation Rising is my Instagram and TikTok handle for my DID, and a lot of art and poetry as well, but mostly DID content in there. And then I also have Constellation Author for my fiction.
Good.
And my fiction is published under our current legal name, which is Bethany A. Jennings. But our online platforms are Constellation Rising and Constellation Author.
Gotcha. And I've put, for those of you watching this, I've put the link down at the bottom, and I'm up to her author page. And I'm
Mhm.
also going to share, for those of you watching, the Amazon page, take a quick scroll down, we have the amazingly titled collection, This Poem is a Weapon.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I see other
Mhm.
things too. You can see here 4, it looks
Mhm.
like, top titles on
Mhm.
Amazon.
Yeah, This Poem is a Weapon is a book of poetry, sort of psalm-like. It sort of walks through my journey of faith throughout first discovering my mental health diagnosis and sort of processing that for the first time. So it kind of walks through that journey. Severed Veil is a poetry and fiction collection from before I was aware of my diagnosis. And then Dragon Lyric and Threadbare are both short stories.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I hope that everyone goes and checks you out on the different platforms. And again, I would encourage everyone listening to this to check out both her advocacy and her fiction, because there really aren't that many voices that I've seen of Christians and Christian advocates doing art, doing stories, and doing just general speaking to raise awareness about this mental health concern and people who have it. And it's something that all of us, if we are going to be compassionate, I think individuals trying to help people need to be aware of.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you sharing about my platforms as well. And having me on here to be able to talk through some of these issues was really exciting to get to discuss all these things with you. And I really appreciate the conversation.
Oh, I really appreciate you coming. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
I would love to. Thank you.
Cool, cool. Well, that wraps up this morning. Keep the faith, everyone. Have a great time, and I will see you next time on Sunday Morning Superheroes.
It's like Coca-Cola, Levi's.